Good morning, friends. As we close out the week, I'd like to do my best to answer one of the most common questions that Christians have. What is God's will for my life? Or to put it a little differently, what is my calling in life? Because in our Matthew 9 passage, we see that we must pray to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. That means that in order to successfully engage in whatever sort of ministry, whatever sort of calling you might have, that calling must come from God. He is the one who sends. We must be God appointed to our callings, not self appointed or man appointed to those tasks. And you might remember that one of the greatest blessings of this is that we then focus on being obedient to that calling, which means we don't need to worry about anything else. Now that doesn't mean we aren't supportive of other things, and we can certainly lend a hand to other folks. That's just a baseline fact of loving one another as we ought to. But the point is that if God has called you to ministry A, then you can help in ministry B as the Lord gives you time and ability, but your focus is ministry A. And you should never let anyone pressure you into a situation where your ministry, the one God has called you to, starts actually suffering because of the other ministry. But that brings us back to the original question. How do I discover God's will or calling for my life so that I can focus on whatever it is He wants me to do? And thankfully, the answer is pretty simple, but it does come in two parts. The first part of the answer comes in the realization that there are some things that God calls all of us to do, and they are clearly laid out in the scriptures. Now, I know that this kind of comes across as the boring part. This is the part where people are so tempted to say, well, of course, I already know that. What I don't know and what I need the answer to is my specific calling. But really, the foundation and the means to your specific calling is found in the general calling that we've all been called to. And what is that? Well, we've been called to pursue sanctification and the living of holy lives before God. As Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians 4:3 and following, "For this is the will of God, your sanctification, that you abstain from sexual immorality, that each one of you know how to control his own body in holiness and honor, not in the passion of lust like the Gentiles who do not know God, that no one should transgress and wrong his brother in this matter. Because the Lord is an avenger in all these things, as we told you beforehand and solemnly warned you. For God has not called us for impurity, but in holiness. Therefore, whoever disregards this disregards not man, but God, who gives his Holy Spirit to you." This is the baseline calling that every single Christian has, that God has not called us for impurity, but in holiness. This is God's will for us, that we be sanctified, which literally means to be made more holy, that we would be able to have self-control for the sake of holiness and honor. And Paul even gives that sober warning at the end of what we read: whoever disregards this disregards not man, but God. You see, so often we are eager, so very eager, and excited and intrigued to discover what God's specific purpose is for our lives. Am I to be a pastor? Am I to be a missionary, or a doctor, or factory worker, or engineer, or teacher, or lab assistant, or whatever else? And that we are so concerned about those things that we blow right past our most essential calling, which is to live a holy life that will bring honor to God's name. Because in the possible callings that I just listed, and of course that list goes almost infinite, you might say, okay, well, being a missionary or being a pastor, it could be considered an obvious choice in how they would honor God. And one might say, well, then on the other side, how does being an engineer or a factory worker, or something else like that, seems more secular, a little bit more just pragmatic. Why would God call me to one of those things? How can I glorify God in those? Well, here's the thing. If you are living a holy life, eager to be sanctified by the power of the Holy Spirit, then you will bring honor to God in your workplace as a factory worker or an engineer or an office worker or whatever you may be. And so God may call you to such a position, a secular career, as one might call it, whether it means you're a blue-collar worker or a white-collar worker, it doesn't matter. And you can fulfill your calling by doing that and being a witness for Christ in that place, simply by living a holy life and doing those baseline things that God calls all of us to do. Just as on the reverse side, you can actually be a pastor or a missionary and yet not bring honor to God's name and not actually fulfill your calling, because despite holding the official ministry position, you're not actually living in holiness, seeking to be sanctified. And unfortunately, there are absolutely missionaries and pastors and other professional ministry type people out there who hold the position and they look really good on the outside, but the Lord is actually not honored by them because they are not seeking to live that baseline holy life, seeking God and His sanctification. The bottom line then is that it doesn't really matter what your specific calling is, in one sense, if you're ignoring the foundational calling of all Christians. If you're not concerned with living a holy life that's honoring to God, then it doesn't really matter where you live or what profession you have or what position you hold in a church body, because you won't be able to fulfill a specific calling if you're not first fulfilling the call to live holy and in submission to God, seeking first His kingdom and righteousness. So that's the first part of our answer, and let's never forget it. That's step number one as to how to find your specific calling in life, is to fulfill the general calling in life that goes out to all of God's people. Because if you're truly seeking to live that holy life for the honor of God, that would then mean that you are seeking first His kingdom and righteousness through Bible study and an application of His truths to your life. You are submitting yourself to His word, and then we ask, okay, Lord, what do you want me to do next? What's the next specific thing? And the answer to that question, I believe, is actually far more freeing and far more open than what many would assume. Because we look at Psalm 37, verses 4 and 5, and we read, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord, trust in Him, and He will act. He will bring forth your righteousness as the light, and your justice as the noonday." I think we find our answer right here, because we have two statements that reaffirm the first step we've already talked about: delight yourself in the Lord, and commit your way to the Lord, trust in Him. These commands are essentially the way we become more holy, the way we gain in sanctification. If we look to the Lord and we find our joy and our satisfaction in Him, then we will be that much more concerned and desirous of Him and of what He wants. If we commit ourselves to Him, if we trust in Him, then we will be eager to do the things that are in keeping with His nature, and we will recognize those things more easily as well. Because if we love the Lord, and we get to know His goodness and His love, His justice and compassion and so on, we familiarize ourselves with these things as they appear in the character and nature of God. Well, then we will see them more clearly when it comes to our decision making, the choices that lie ahead of us, and when they are absent, when we think about a choice and one of the options before us seems to line up with God's character, whereas the other one is very jarring, because, wow, no, I don't see God's goodness in that. I don't see justice in that. I don't see mercy or whatever. Well, that helps us to make a choice that is more in line with God's goodness. Because when we read, in addition to this, delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart, that does mean delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you whatever you want. It really does mean that. Except there's a qualifier. Think about it. If our delight is in the Lord, then what do we want? More of Him, right? Sometimes people look at this and say, all right, if I delight myself in the Lord, then I can have everything I want, which means vacations or more money or, a particular relationship or whatever. No, delighting yourself in the Lord is not a mechanical thing that you just plug this in and say, okay, Lord, I delight myself in you. Now give me what I want. No, if we delight ourselves in the Lord, it means we want the Lord. It means He is the one that fulfills us and grants us all the satisfaction we need. Which means then that He will give us the desires of our heart, because our desires of our heart are Him. Okay? Now, there's a couple ways we can look at this, and I think that they both have application. The one is that if we want Him, He is the desire of our heart. He will always give Himself to us. In that way, He gives us the desires of our heart. But the other way to look at it is, delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart. In other words, He will give you the desires in the first place. Before your heart was changed by the Holy Spirit, your desire would have been for yourself and your own pursuits. But your heart having been changed by God, your heart is now oriented to God now, and now He gives you new desires. He gives you new desires for your heart to desire. And this means that the more we seek God Himself, the more we are able to recognize the more we seek God Himself, the more we're able to recognize the calling that He gives us simply by identifying the desires He gives us. So as you pursue the Lord, as you read of Him in His Word, as you learn and live in honor to Him, then you might find yourself being convicted with a new desire you've never had before. Just as a standard example, you might be pulled toward youth ministry. All of a sudden, you just find that your heart is burdened for the kids in the church and the wider community. And perhaps that is God giving you the desire in your heart, making the desire of your heart, that you desire to see young people come to know Jesus. So go for it. Now, don't go off half-cocked. Talk to your elders and other mature Christians for advice, to figure out logistics and whatnot. But hey, if your heart goes out to the kids, then find ways to minister to kids. And if for some reason that isn't your calling, then don't worry. The Lord may close the door on that opportunity. But then you see where there might be a door open somewhere else, because God is sovereign over all this. And if you're trying to do something because you love God and you're doing it because you want to honor Him, then you really can't go far wrong. You might go down a path that He doesn't want you to go down, but He's not going to be mad at you for it, for trying to honor Him in that way. Just start with the desires of your heart and move forward. Try something. And the Lord will either confirm that as your calling, or He will providentially alter your course until you are right in the groove where He wants you to be. But again, it all starts with delighting ourselves in the Lord, committing ourselves to Him first and foremost. And that foundational calling is absolutely essential. Seeking God, His kingdom, and His righteousness, honestly and earnestly, desiring to live a holy life to glorify His name, and then He will lead you in the way you should go after that. With that in mind, I pray you have a good and godly day, and Lord willing, I'll see you soon.